Have you ever taken action photos in poor light and had results like this? Well, welcome to the club. I'm sure we all have at some point, and even many years after starting off in sports photography, it still happens from time to time. However, what if I said there are some things you can do and some steps you can take that almost always eradicate any photos that are no longer tack sharp in poor light? Well, there are a few things that you can do, and in this video, I'm going to run through some of those with you. Taking sharp photos in low light conditions can be a real challenge, and if you're under floodlights or maybe shooting in an indoor arena under really kind of luminant light, it can just make your photos look poor, and you can really lose that tack sharpness that we're all looking for in our photos. That you have to reduce the shutter to compensate for the poor light, and you lose some of that crispness, and it just kind of becomes a little bit weak and disheartening when you see those photos back in your camera or in post after the event. However, the good news is, as I said, there are steps you can take to give yourself the best chance. I'm not guaranteeing, but almost being certain you're going to get nice, crisp sports photos or action photos in low light. And let's be honest here, if you're watching this with a $5 or an $8 camera at your disposal that's fairly modern, it's likely that the functionality in that and how it handles low light and noise and nice ISO settings and all the rest of it will give yourself a really good chance anyway. And so a lot of this, while it's still useful, isn't as important as someone like me who is shooting on a 12 or 14-year-old camera, whatever the 1D Mark IV is. Also, if you're shooting on not a professional grade camera, I shoot some games on an 80D, which was probably never built for sports. I've shot on a 400D in professional sports at night. So whatever you're shooting up with, unless it's really high end, you're going to need to get really good at shooting in low light to get those nice sharp photos. So without further ado, let's jump straight in and see how we can do it. Number one, shoot in manual. Now, I know this might seem simple, but in most indoor or low light scenarios, so for example, certainly if you're indoors, the lights are going to be constant. So you don't need to worry about changing settings for exposure. You get it right once and then you're free to carry on shooting. So I get it in manual, get the best shutter speed you can while keeping the ISO as low as possible. Obviously your aperture as low as possible, as wide open as you can get it, and use manual to achieve that. If you're outside, maybe under floodlights, if you've not shot under floodlights outside at a professional sport ground even, I shoot at loads of stadiums where it's really bright in the middle of the pitch and the corners actually are a lot darker, or maybe not to the naked eye, but when you're shooting with your camera, it really is. So maybe there are some scenarios when you might prefer shutter priority, but overall, by and large, I would always pick to shoot in manual. Now, number two is to shoot in RAW. Now, I'll be honest, for the first probably 6 or 7 years I was shooting for professional football, I didn't use RAW to shoot, and that was absolutely fine. I got away with it more often than not. The JPEGs it produced were lovely and tack sharp out of the 1D Mark IV, and I didn't have any problems whatsoever. However, as that camera has aged and as I seem to shoot at grounds with poorer floodlights every season, or maybe floodlights that are just aging, the mixture of the two mean that my photos over the last probably year at night have really degraded. They've got a lot softer. And so I decided to start shooting on RAW. And another reason for this, if you've watched one of my previous videos, I think the match day vlog I did a couple of weeks ago, the day in the life of, I mentioned that my camera was stopping. It wasn't shooting as sharp as it was when we talk about the focusing element. And another reason I've managed to get around that is switching into RAW, because in RAW it focuses as well as it always has. Now, the big benefit with RAW as well is if you shoot and you underexpose the photo or overexpose the photo, which is less likely in poor light, you are able, using camera RAW, to bring a lot more detail back into that photo without kind of the quality of the photo degrading as a digital file. So if you've got an underexposed JPEG and you crank that exposure up in, say, Camera Raw or Lightroom, wherever you're working, you'll see a lot of noise and fuzz kind of introduced into that image. If you're shooting RAW, the file is bigger and the damage to that file when you kind of crank that exposure back up is nowhere near as profound, So shooting in RAW gives you a lot more room for error, and if you do have to underexpose, maybe just to keep a little bit more noise out of the image, if your ISO settings on your camera do produce a lot of noise, then shooting in RAW might save you on that point. So the benefits of RAW, it's going to be a lot clearer. It's going to give you a lot more room to maneuver when we want to bring the exposure back up in post as well. Also, if you want to tweak things such as clarity and contrast, which can really help bring sports photos and action photos alive, especially at night. Also, dragging the shadows down in sports photos can really help bring the subjects out, as long as they're not in a black or a dark kind of blue or navy kit. All those things perform so much better and give you a much cleaner and more satisfying result if you've shot in RAW and if you're editing the RAW file. Number 3 is start with your shutter speed. Now, when I mentioned before on manual, if you're shooting on manual, like I say, you'll have to obviously set your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. Now, the starting point for me, at least, is always the shutter speed. As a starting point in bad light, I'll try and start at least 1/1000th of a second. And I've seen a lot of photographers and kind of blogs and that online say you can shoot sport from like soccer and American football, etc., and basketball from 1/500th of a second. I would always try and start actually at 1/1000th, because that is going to give you a much crisper shot. When we bring into consideration the poor light, you might have to bring that down slightly, but only do that once you've tried to or tested getting a shot away with 1/1000th and your aperture as wide as you can get it and your ISO as high as it needs to be. Obviously, the higher that goes, the more noise you're going to introduce. So start with your shutter. If you have to bring your shutter down, you can do so. But don't be mindful, if you are shooting an action sport, don't forget, in action sport, the movement is quick, or by and large, it's quick. So having a faster shutter is going to freeze that image and freeze that action, so it is nice and sharp. So try and keep your shutter as high as possible. That said, there are times when it just won't be possible, and if that's the case, so be it. Again, you're shooting in RAW, so you're going to give yourself a good chance to rescue and improve the image in post-editing after the shoot. There was a game I did a non-league round here in the UK probably 6 or 7 years ago. The floodlights were absolutely horrendous. It's like someone's backyard light rather than actually sports ground lights. And I think my shutter that night at times was down to something like 1/250th of 250th of a second. Far too slow, really, but that's how low I had to go. So sometimes you can't avoid it, but if you follow these tips and keep that shutter as high as you can, you should get better results. Okay, now the shutter is set, let's talk about your aperture. Now, obviously, your glass you have, the lens you have, that is going to impact directly what aperture you can get. Now, a lot of photographers in my early days always said they prioritize buying glass, so lenses, rather than camera bodies. And I actually understood this once I'd upgraded to a 70-200 f2.8 Canon lens, or Sigma was actually the first one I got. And that's because the lower the aperture you can get down, the lower the f number, the wider the aperture or the bigger the aperture, and the more light will get into your image. So get that aperture as small as you can. Your lens might only let you come down to f4.0 or something like that. If that's the case, fine, that's what you'll have to shoot with. It might be that the lowest you can go is f6.5 or something. Again, absolutely fine. Get it down to the lowest you can get. So shutter high, aperture nice and low. And obviously number 5 is the ISO. So we're going to move that ISO up to whatever it needs to be. Obviously, the lower end cameras, or cameras that perhaps weren't designed for sports photography or action photography at night in poor light, they're going to introduce a load of noise the higher you get up through those ISO settings. So my Canon 80D I'm filming this on, I also throw a big 400mm lens on that. And occasionally, if I try and get some shots away from the middle of the pitch where the floodlights are great and up the kind of the sides and my ISO is really high, the photos are just far too noisy to use. I'm going to drop a couple of examples I shot in here now so you can see just how noisy those images become. Finally is trying to get rid of some of the noise in post-editing. Now, there are loads of different tools out there for you to kind of edit your photos with to try and reduce the noise. I think Lightroom now has some in itself, but also try using, as I said before, things like your contrast. So if you've got a photo where the subject is maybe in a white kit and the opposition is in a yellow kit or something, as long as they're not too dark, the colours, you can actually crank the contrast up a little bit, drop the shadows down, and that's actually going to bring the subject or the players, the athletes, out of that photo a little bit more and step it away from the background, and then all the noise that's in the background kind of disappears because the photo is so dark in those areas. Also, I should have mentioned on the last point, sometimes with ISO, I'm really scared to go too high, but sometimes going a set 1 or 2 levels higher in the ISO than you think you need to actually produces less noise because it's better exposed, so all the photo, more of the photo is visible. Hard to explain, but trust me on this, especially when you've shot raw, kind of getting those details exposed properly can come if you go a little bit higher with your ISO than you think you need to. However, do just be cautious of that noise. So yeah, see what add-ons are available in post for you to edit and get rid of some of that noise. Try contrast, try, there's a few different things you can try in Lightroom. Just play around with the sliders, get in camera raw and play with some of the sliders and settings there and see if you can try and take some of that noise away. Photoshop as well, I think, has a denoise filter. Try that. Try whatever tools you have available to reduce some of that noise down. I hope that was helpful. It was really like a really quick whistle-stop tour of how you can try and get clean action photos every time. And I honestly believe shoot in RAW, shoot in manual, higher shutter as you can, and watch how high your ISO goes. I think if you follow those key steps, you're going to have better photos than if you're shooting on JPEG and you bring in the shutter down to accommodate for some of the other settings, perhaps not getting as much light in as you need to. If you've got any tips to share, please drop them in the comments below. I try to read and reply to all comments on my channel. And if you've enjoyed the video or found it useful, I would love you to subscribe to my channel. Over 1,000 subscribers now, which has blown me away a little bit, to be honest, but really appreciate it. And even if you don't subscribe, I hope I see you on the next video. Thank you for watching.